The wind carried a silence so heavy it felt older than the mountains themselves. In the deep hollows of West Virginia, where the mists hung low and time seemed to have stopped breathing, a place existed that maps forgot. It was here, among the cold ridges and crooked trees, that the Whittaker family lived, unseen, unspoken, and untouched by the rest of the world. People said their cabin wasn't just hidden by distance. It was hidden by something darker, a kind of curse that could be felt in the air long before the cabin came into view. Locals didn't visit the Whittaker Hollow unless they had no other choice. They said when the wind blew through those woods, it didn't sound like wind, it whispered. And sometimes, if you stood still long enough, you could hear what sounded like voices calling your name. Whether it was fear, guilt, or imagination, no one knew. But what they did know was this: the Whittaker family had lived there for generations, and no one quite understood where one generation ended and another began. But before we continue with this disturbing story, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves hidden stories. It helps bring more of these untold truths to light. By the turn of the 20th century, West Virginia was still a world of coal and quiet suffering. Small towns dotted the valleys, tired faces, coal-black hands, and church bells that tolled for men who never came back from the mines. But beyond those small towns were places civilization hadn't yet reached. The hollers, deep hidden valleys surrounded by ridges so steep the sun touched them only a few hours a day. These were places of isolation, where families lived and died without ever seeing the outside world. The Whittakers were one of those families. Their name appeared in church records dating back to the 1850s, then vanished for decades. When it reappeared, it was whispered about in the towns of Odd and Raleigh County. There were rumors that they didn't marry outside their own kin, that their children never attended school, that their bloodline had folded in on itself, creating something not quite right, not quite wrong, but deeply unsettling. Their home was an old log cabin built at the edge of a dry creek, miles from the nearest road. It was said the house leaned slightly, as if exhausted by the years it had witnessed. The wood was gray and splintered, with moss growing up the sides. The windows were fogged from the inside, always. No one could remember a time the door had been open in daylight. Travelers who passed through the region told stories of seeing movement in the woods, faces half hidden behind the trees, watching silently as strangers crossed their land. In 1902, the story of the Whittakers began to surface again. A traveling preacher named Reverend Charles McCready had gone missing on his way to a mining town across the ridge. His horse was later found grazing near a broken fence post not far from the Whittaker Hollow. The townsfolk organized a search party, and though most men were reluctant, a few brave souls followed the trail through the underbrush, down into the hollow where no one wanted to go. They found the cabin by nightfall. The moonlight fell cold against the roof and smoke curled faintly from the chimney. The place seemed alive, but not in a human way. As they approached, they could hear a rhythmic sound, like a low hum, or perhaps prayer. When one of the men knocked, there was no answer, but the door creaked open on its own, slow and uneasy, as if the house itself had been waiting. Inside, the air was thick, a mix of candle wax, sweat, and the heavy scent of something unwashed for too long. 4 figures sat silently around a wooden table. The father, Elias Whittaker, tall and thin with a gray beard that reached his chest. His eyes were sunken, his lips unmoving. Beside him, his wife Martha, hands folded, eyes locked on the flame of a candle as though it were her last companion. 2 children, a boy and a girl, sat perfectly still, their expressions hollow, like portraits that had lost their souls. No one spoke for nearly a minute. Then Elias raised his head slowly, his neck bones cracking with the motion, and said in a soft, almost tender voice, "Preacher won't be leaving tonight." When the men returned to town the next morning, they were pale, quiet, and trembling. They refused to talk about what they'd seen, except to say that the preacher had likely gotten lost, and that no one should ever go looking for him again. Within days, whispers filled the town. Some said the Whittakers had offered him food and shelter. Others swore they'd done far worse. No proof ever surfaced, but the fear was enough. The path to the hollow grew over with vines, and people stopped mentioning the family altogether. But the truth didn't stay buried. Not in a place like West Virginia, where secrets are heavier than the stones in the mountains. In the following weeks, hunters began reporting strange sounds echoing through the forest, something like crying, but not human. Others claimed they found footprints too large to belong to any child, too small for any man. And in the distance, faint lights flickered among the trees at night, as though candles were being carried through the mist. The Whittakers, it seemed, had become something more than human gossip. They had become myth, and myths, as the old people said, are born from truth. When the sun rose the next morning, the fog hadn't lifted from Whittaker Hollow. It hung low between the trees like breath frozen in time. The men who had ventured there the previous night, the ones who saw Elias Whittaker and his silent family, spoke of the experience only in fragments. Some said the eyes of the children followed them as they left. Others swore they saw someone else in the shadows behind the cabin, someone who hadn't moved but was watching all along. The missing preacher was never found. His disappearance was filed under lost to the wilderness, and no one argued. But the people of Raleigh County carried something heavier than suspicion. They carried fear. And fear, in a small town, spreads faster than fire. Within a week, talk of the Whittakers filled every tavern, every church whisper, every porch conversation that stretched into dusk. Some said Elias had been cursed, that his grandfather had once taken a woman against her will, deep in those woods, and the family was still paying for his sin. Others said they weren't even human anymore, that too many years of living without outsiders had changed them somehow, reshaping their blood, dulling their minds, and twisting their faces. No one could prove anything. But everyone agreed on one thing. If you went into Whittaker Hollow after dark, you didn't come back the same. By autumn of that same year, a man named Thomas Rayburn, a state photographer working for the Charleston Herald, arrived in the county. He was documenting rural poverty in the Appalachian Mountains, the kind of forgotten lives the rest of America pretended not to see. Rayburn had heard whispers about the Whittakers from a coal foreman, a family so far gone into isolation that their very existence felt like myth. When he asked directions to their home, the locals warned him away. Some stories, one old man said, ain't meant to be photographed. But Thomas was young, ambitious, and too curious for his own good. He carried with him a camera, a notebook, and an old Colt revolver, just in case. For 2 days, he rode through the ridges, following overgrown paths and animal trails until the sound of civilization vanished entirely. On the third morning, as fog rolled through the valley like smoke from the earth, he found it. The cabin stood just as the rumors described, crooked, slanted, leaning toward the ground like it was tired of standing. A single wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, dissolving into the mist. There were no birds, no wind, no sound at all, just the creak of wood under the weight of silence. Thomas dismounted his horse, adjusted his lens, and approached. He knocked twice. No answer. Then, softly the door opened, not by hand, but as if it had been waiting for him. Inside, the air was stale. The smell was a mixture of old earth and something that had never known sunlight. In the dim glow from the window, he saw them. 4 figures. They were sitting around a table, exactly as described. Elias, Martha, the young man, and the girl. They did not move. They did not speak. They just stared, directly into the lens of the stranger who had stepped into their world. Thomas hesitated. The silence was too heavy to break with words. He raised his camera instead. The flash went off, a burst of white light, slicing through decades of shadow. In that instant, none of them blinked. When his vision cleared, the image was burned into his mind. 4 pale faces, expressionless, unmoving. Their eyes fixed forward, not in surprise but in acceptance, as though they had been waiting their whole lives for that moment, to be seen, one last time. He left without saying a word. That night, as he camped miles away in the forest, Thomas developed the photograph under the red light of his lantern. At first, it looked ordinary, a family, still and tired. But as the image began to emerge, he noticed something else. Behind Elias's chair in the dark corner of the room, there was a 5th shape. Faint, human, standing, head tilted. But Thomas was certain no one else had been there. He stared at the photo until dawn, the image swimming in the chemical basin, the shadowed figure watching him from the paper. By morning, the photograph was dry, By afternoon, Thomas Rayburn was gone. His horse was found days later, wandering aimlessly by the ridge. His notebook and camera were discovered near a stream, both waterlogged. The glass plate from that last photo was cracked clean down the middle. Over the next months, the Whittaker name became a curse in the region. Children were warned not to say it after sunset. Preachers avoided sermons about sins of the blood. But legends don't die easily. In 1905, a state census taker named Margaret Ellison was assigned to document every household in the remote counties of southern West Virginia. She was a strong, plain woman in her 40s, practical, God-fearing, and fearless. When she arrived in the town of Odd, she asked a shopkeeper if he knew of the Whittakers. The man's face drained of color. "They're still there," he said, "but they ain't what they were." She wrote the name down anyway. Duty was duty. The next morning, Margaret packed her horse and followed the overgrown trail toward the hollow. The trees grew denser with every mile. The air thickened with the smell of rot and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard a child's laugh, quick, sharp, and out of place. When she finally saw the cabin through the trees, the light was already fading. The windows were darker now. No smoke from the chimney. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if time itself had stopped breathing there. She called out once, "Elias Whittaker?" No answer. She called again. Her voice seemed to vanish into the air, swallowed by the silence. Then, a sound, not from inside, from beneath the floorboards. Margaret froze. The noise was faint, scraping, dragging, slow. Something shifting in the darkness below the cabin. She stepped forward, pushed the door open, and was hit by a wave of air so cold it burned her throat. The room was empty. Dust hung in the light like tiny ghosts. The table and chairs were gone. Only one thing remained, a broken picture frame lying face down on the floor. She knelt down, lifted it carefully. Inside was a photograph, old, faded, but unmistakable. 4 figures, Elias, Martha, the son, the daughter, and behind them, in the shadow of the wall, that same 5th shape. Margaret dropped the frame. It shattered. The sound echoed in the emptiness. Something moved behind her. She turned. At first, she thought it was the wind. But then she saw it. The faint outline of a face in the dark corner, pale and half-hidden. Eyes reflecting just a shimmer of dying light. It smiled. Barely. Margaret screamed. The echo traveled down the hollow, across the ridges, and was never heard again. Weeks later, a search party found her horse wandering near the river. Her notebook was discovered not far from where the preachers had vanished years before. Inside, the last line she had written was smeared by water, but one word was still clear: alive. By 1907, the cabin had collapsed into itself. Locals said you could still see smoke rising from the ground on cold nights, as though the earth itself remembered the fire that once burned there. Hunters avoided the hollow entirely, claiming that sometimes they'd see faces watching from the tree line, faces that didn't move or blink. But others swore that in certain winters, when the air was still and the fog was low, you could hear something else, a whisper, a faint voice calling from the woods, not angry, not mournful, but pleading. Some said it was the preacher. Some said it was Margaret. And some said it was the Whittakers, still waiting in that hollow, untouched by time, unseen by God, whispering the same words again and again. Don't forget us. The year was 1910, and by then the Whittaker Hollow had been swallowed almost entirely by the forest. Nature had reclaimed what man had forgotten. Trees grew through the bones of the old cabin. Moss covered what was once the front door. To anyone passing by, it was nothing but a ruin, a scar on the land, long healed and left behind. But not everyone believed it was over. In the nearby town of Raleigh, stories of the Whittakers still lingered in whispers. Some miners claimed they heard voices calling from deep shafts when they worked at night. Names they didn't recognize, but that carried an ache of human sorrow. Others told of pale figures glimpsed at the edge of their lantern light, staring from the tree line before melting back into the dark. The fear should have faded by now, but instead it grew quieter, heavier, like the air before a storm. Then one summer evening, a young journalist named Henry Caldwell arrived from Charleston. He had come chasing the kind of story that could make a career. His editor had found an old, water-damaged glass plate photo in a museum archive, a photograph labeled only Family, West Virginia, 1902. 4 figures sat stiffly at a table inside a cabin, faces pale, blank, emotionless, and behind them, in the blurred shadow, a 5th shape. The archive curator had no record of where it came from, only that the photographer's name, Thomas Rayburn, was written on the back in smudged ink. Henry felt something when he saw that image, not fear, exactly, but curiosity sharpened by dread. Who were they? Why had no one ever heard of them again? He decided to find out. Henry arrived in Raleigh in late August. The air was thick with humidity, the smell of coal dust hanging over the town like smoke. When he asked about the Whittakers, the innkeeper's hand trembled as she poured his coffee. "You shouldn't go there," she said softly. "That place don't forget who visits." But Henry wasn't the kind to be scared off by superstition. He smiled, thanked her, and the next morning set off toward the hollow, carrying his notebook, a lantern, and a revolver, though he wasn't sure why he brought it. The forest greeted him with silence. No birds. No wind, only the sound of his boots crunching on old leaves and the distant hum of unseen insects. The deeper he went, the more the world behind him faded. By noon, the sunlight barely reached the ground. And then, he found it, the Whittaker cabin, or what remained of it. The roof had caved in, the chimney half collapsed. But somehow the air around it still felt wrong. Still heavy, like the space itself remembered what had happened there. Henry stood there for a long moment before stepping closer. Each board creaked beneath his feet, echoing like whispers beneath the soil. Inside, everything was dust and decay. But on the far wall, faint and half-hidden under rot, was something unexpected. A drawing, scratched into the wood with a nail, crude and childlike. 4 figures holding hands, a 5th standing behind them, larger, featureless, faceless, and below, carved in jagged letters. Still here. Henry's throat tightened. He knelt to examine it more closely. The cuts were old, years old, maybe decades. But the wood beneath was darker than the surface, as though something oily had seeped into it. He pulled out his notebook and began to sketch what he saw. Then a sound, soft, almost polite, came from behind him. A cough. He turned sharply. A man stood in the doorway, frail, hunched, with a beard as white as bone. His clothes were torn, his skin grayish and thin. For a moment Henry thought it might be a trick of light. But the man blinked. "Elias Whittaker?" Henry asked before realizing the impossibility of it. The man smiled faintly. "They said we were gone," he rasped. "But the hollow keeps what's its own." Henry took a cautious step forward. "You can't still be—" The man's eyes flicked toward the floorboards. "Still," he whispered. "Always still." And then he was gone, vanished into the doorway as if the fog itself had swallowed him whole. Henry stumbled back, heart hammering. The air grew colder. He turned and saw, on the floor where Elias had stood, a faint wet footprint, leading toward the trapdoor near the back wall. He hesitated only a second before pulling the latch. The wooden hatch groaned open, releasing a gust of air that smelled of damp earth and something else, something sweet, like decay and time. Lantern in hand, Henry descended the creaking steps into darkness. The cellar was low and narrow. Dirt walls pressed in close. Cobwebs clung to his sleeves. But what caught his breath was what lay in the center. A table, roughly built from planks, and upon it, several old photographs, warped and yellowed with age. He picked one up. 4 faces stared back. The Whittakers. Another, the same. Another, again, the same. Each photo slightly different, but in every one the faces were older, more hollow, more distorted by time, and always that 5th shadow standing behind them. Closer each time. Henry's lantern flickered. He looked around the cellar, and then saw something in the far corner. A pile of wood and rags shaped almost like a body. He moved closer. It wasn't wood, it was bone. Human bones. Small ones, adult ones, some with cloth still clinging to them. At least 6, maybe more. And on one skull, a faint cross carved into the forehead. Henry stumbled back, gagging. His lantern swung wildly, throwing shadows across the walls, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw faces in those shadows. Watching him, smiling, he dropped the lantern. The flame burst as it hit the dirt. Smoke filled the cellar. He scrambled up the stairs, coughing, eyes burning. But as he reached the surface, he froze. Through the smoke, 4 shapes stood at the edge of the clearing, still, silent, pale as ash. They were waiting. By nightfall, Henry Caldwell's horse came galloping back into town, saddle torn, reins hanging loose. The men found him 2 days later near the creek, clothes soaked, eyes open but empty. The local doctor said he was alive, but his mind was gone. He didn't speak for days. When he finally did, his first words were a whisper. They were never dead. He died that winter in a hospital in Charleston. Among his belongings was a single photograph, blurred, almost colorless, but faintly visible. 4 figures standing in the ruins of the cabin. Behind them, that 5th shape, tall, faceless, looming, and scrawled in pencil across the back. The Hollow remembers. As years passed, the Whittaker story faded into local legend, half folklore, half cautionary tale. Parents told it to frighten their children into staying close to home. Preachers used it as proof of what happens when man isolates himself from God. But the truth of the Whittakers never really died. Because every few decades, someone new wandered into those hills. A traveler, a hunter, a fool, and came back changed. Some came back silent, some came back sick, some didn't come back at all. And still, to this day, the old folks say that if you find the Hollow, you'll know it. Because the air there feels different, heavy, breathless, alive. And if you stay too long, you might just hear them whisper. Not angry, not pleading, just remembering, still here. By the time the 1930s rolled in, the story of the Whittakers had become more myth than memory. The Great Depression had swallowed West Virginia whole, jobs lost, families scattered, and old towns decaying into the earth. But among the ruins, one man carried a growing obsession. Dr. Charles Marin, an anthropologist from the University of Pennsylvania. Marin wasn't a man easily frightened. He'd spent years studying isolated Appalachian communities, documenting how poverty and isolation could twist language, culture, even genetics. But there was one name that kept resurfacing in his field notes, passed down like a curse whispered over campfires: the Whittaker Hollow. At first, he dismissed it as folklore. Then he found Henry Caldwell's notebook, stored in a Charleston museum archive, forgotten, stained with water and ash. Inside were frantic sketches, scattered notes, and one final sentence, underlined twice. The 5th is not human. Something about those words burrowed deep into Marin's mind. He packed his bags, ignored the warnings of his colleagues, and by late autumn of 1933, he was heading south, straight into the mountains that everyone else avoided. The train dropped him at Beckley, a gray mining town fading beneath constant drizzle. Locals stared when he mentioned the Whittaker name. One old miner spat tobacco juice and muttered, "You go looking for ghosts, boy, you'll find 'em hungry." But Marin smiled politely and rented a mule from the stable. He carried only what he needed: camera, recorder, and a leather-bound field journal. He told himself it was science, not superstition. 2 days later, he reached the edge of the hollow. The forest seemed older here, thicker, darker. The trees nodded like veins. Even the birds refused to sing. At sunset, he made camp near what looked like an abandoned path. He lit his lantern, opened Caldwell's notebook, and compared its hand-drawn map to his surroundings. The ridgeline matched. The creek still ran in the same direction. And at the bottom of the hollow, the cabin. He found it the next morning, hidden beneath centuries of growth. The roof had collapsed entirely now, the chimney nothing but a mound of stone and moss. But as Marin approached, he felt something cold slide through him. Not wind, not air, but a pressure, like being watched from every direction at once. He took a photograph, noted the coordinates, then began carefully clearing debris. Beneath the rotted boards, he discovered what Caldwell must have seen 30 years earlier: the trapdoor. hesitated. Then he opened it. The smell hit him first. The damp, sweet rot of something long buried. He descended slowly, lantern flickering, breath echoing off dirt walls. And there they were, bones. Dozens of them, half sunk into the soil, tangled together as if they'd been buried in haste. Small bones, large bones, a child's skull pressed against an adult's ribcage. He counted at least 11. For a moment, he could only stand there silent, the weight of a century pressing down on him. Then he noticed something carved into the cellar wall, barely visible beneath layers of grime. Letters. "Our blood keeps us whole." Marin shuddered. He began snapping photographs. Each flash burst illuminated the horror in fragments, pale shapes, hollow sockets, scratches on bone. Then his lens caught something else. In the far corner, a tunnel. Narrow, dark, leading deeper underground. He crouched, lantern in hand, and crawled inside. The tunnel sloped downward, twisting like a vein beneath the mountain. The air grew colder, the walls slick with moisture. Then, after what felt like an eternity, it opened into a cavern. Marin lifted the lantern and froze. The walls were covered in drawings, hundreds of them, scrawled in charcoal and ash, stick figures, spirals, crude faces with hollow eyes, and always, in the center, a tall shape with no features. Around the edges were words, repeated over and over in broken English. "We stay, we stay, we stay." And below them, a pile of bones. At first he thought they were animal, but when his light passed over the skulls, he saw otherwise. Each one had been carved with strange symbols, circles intersecting lines, patterns that made his skin crawl just to look at. He stumbled backward, heart pounding. When his lantern flickered, something moved in the dark, a soft scraping sound. Breathing, slow, uneven, close. He turned. Nothing. But when he looked back toward the wall, one of the stick figures had been smudged, fresh, as if touched by a wet hand, and beneath it, a new message had appeared in dripping soot. "Still here." Marin bolted from the tunnel, tripping over rocks and bones, lungs burning. He clawed his way up through the cellar, burst into daylight, and collapsed beside the ruins of the cabin. He didn't stop running until the forest began to thin. Only when he reached open air did he dare to look back. And for the briefest instant, he saw something at the cabin's doorway. A figure, tall, motionless, head tilted slightly, as though watching him go. He didn't speak of what he'd found for years. His notes were detailed, his photographs carefully archived, but he refused to publish them. His colleagues said he'd changed, quiet, withdrawn, paranoid. Then, in 1937, his assistant found him dead in his office. No sign of struggle. No cause of death. On his desk, one envelope. Inside it, a photograph. The Whittaker cabin. In the doorway, faint but visible, 5 shadows. On the back, in Marin's own handwriting, "They keep multiplying." By the 1950s, the story resurfaced again, this time through urban legends spread among teenagers. They called it the Hollow Curse. Kids dared each other to find the ruins, to bring something back. One boy did. A rusted nail from the cabin's wall. A week later, his house caught fire. His parents escaped. He didn't. The nail was found in his pocket. Sheriff Daniels, the one who investigated the scene, told reporters it was an accident, faulty wiring. But off record, he told a different story. He said he saw something in the smoke, faces, 4 of them, watching from the window. After that, the county declared the area restricted. Roads were closed, the land marked as unsafe for travel due to unstable terrain. But locals knew the truth. They said the hollow still breathes. Time passed. The modern world forgot him, but the land didn't. Satellite maps show nothing unusual. No ruins, no trail. Yet hikers who stray too far into the western ridges of Raleigh County still talk of a place where the GPS freezes, where the forest grows unnaturally silent, and where pale shapes move between the trees. Those who return often speak the same phrase, without knowing why. Still here. But what really became of the Whittakers? Was it disease, madness, or something older, something born not of man, But of the Earth itself, no one truly knows, because every record, every map, every name tied to that family eventually disappears, burned, lost, erased, as if the land itself is protecting something. Some say the Whittakers were the last of an ancient line, settlers who turned inward when the world turned its back, and worshipped something they called the Fifth. Others claim that whatever haunted them still waits beneath that hollow, patient, buried but awake. And if you ever find yourself in the hills of West Virginia, and the woods go quiet all at once, if you feel eyes on your back when you know you're alone, don't turn around. Because some say, once you see them, they remember you too. By the time the 1960s arrived, the Whittaker name had become little more than a whisper, the kind of legend that grandfathers told at campfires to make children behave. But deep inside the dusty archives of the West Virginia State Police, one file remained locked under restricted clearance. Stamped in bold red, Case 0149, Whittaker Hollow Investigation. The file was first reopened in 1962 after two surveyors, working for a new mining project, vanished near the old Raleigh County Ridge. Their truck was found idling on the side of the dirt road, headlights still on, maps scattered on the dashboard, but no trace of them. 2 weeks later, one of their helmets was discovered 5 miles away, lying in a creek. Inside it, a piece of paper, soaked and barely legible, written in smudged graphite. We heard them calling from below. That was enough to send a small investigative unit into the hollow. Leading the team was Detective Samuel Grover, a decorated officer in his 40s, rational, methodical, not easily shaken. But even he felt uneasy the moment their convoy crossed into the Whittaker territory. The forest felt wrong. No sound of insects, no wind, just stillness, heavy, suffocating, endless. They followed the path described in Dr. Marin's old notes. The cabin, or what was left of it, had almost vanished, reclaimed by roots and moss. But the trapdoor was still there. They opened it carefully, their flashlights cutting through the blackness below. A ladder led into what seemed like a shallow pit, but the air was thick, stale, like the breath of something ancient. Grover climbed down first. His boots hit dirt, soft and uneven. His light caught fragments, bones, collapsed beams, pieces of furniture long rotted away. And then, carved faintly into the wall, the same words Marin had described. Our blood keeps us whole. The deeper they went, the colder it grew. They found another tunnel, the same one Marin had entered decades before. But now the drawings had multiplied, hundreds of them, faces, symbols, spirals, and at the end of the tunnel, a sealed doorway. The wood looked newer than the rest of the cabin, as if someone had rebuilt it after Marin's visit. Grover hesitated, then pried it open with his crowbar. What they found inside didn't make sense. A small underground room lined with makeshift shelves. On them, jars filled with preserved specimens, hands, eyes, small pieces of flesh floating in amber liquid. Each jar labeled with a name, Mary, Daniel, Joseph, and so on. But one jar stood apart from the rest. It was larger. Inside floated something that looked human, and yet not. A malformed head, its features twisted, eyes sealed shut, the skin ghostly pale. A note taped to the glass read only, "The Fifth." Grover turned away, nauseated. His partner, Officer Hensley, muttered, "Jesus, what the hell is this place?" And then, the sound, a slow dragging noise from the tunnel behind them, not footsteps. Something heavier, something breathing. They swung their flashlights toward the sound, but the beam only illuminated dust and empty air. Then Hensley screamed. His light caught a glimpse. A tall, pale figure crouched low at the end of the passage, limbs too long, face blank. It moved, not walking, but folding through the dark, like its bones bent the wrong way. The team fired. The flash filled the tunnel with smoke and thunder. When the light cleared, nothing, except for a smear of dark, thick fluid on the wall. Grover ordered immediate evacuation. They sealed the tunnel with explosives, marking the site as unstable, but the official report would later call it an accident during geological inspection. The file was buried. Grover resigned a year later, refusing to speak about what he'd seen. In 1974, a journalist named Lydia Corbin uncovered part of the report. Through a Freedom of Information request, she published an article titled, "The Hollow That Doesn't Sleep." It gained local attention for a few weeks, until Lydia vanished. Her car was found abandoned on a mountain road. Inside, her tape recorder. The last 2 minutes of the tape were nearly silent, just the sound of wind and creaking branches. But faintly, beneath the static, there was something else. A voice, whispering, repeating the same words, over and over. We stay, we stay, we stay. Over the next few decades, strange reports continued. Hikers missing, hunters returning pale and speechless, satellite photos showing unnatural depressions in the forest floor, as if the land itself kept shifting. In 1999, when a wildfire swept through the area, firefighters discovered what looked like a sinkhole, perfectly circular, nearly 30 feet wide. They descended to inspect it, but before they reached the bottom, the ground began to collapse inward. Later analysis of soil samples found human DNA, but not from any known record. It was traced to a genetic line extinct since the early 1900s. By 2002, the state officially declared the Whittaker Hollow a protected environmental hazard zone. But insiders claimed something else was happening. Satellite data showed recurring heat signatures, faint, pulsing like a heartbeat, emanating from deep beneath the ridge. And every time it appeared, the same phenomenon followed. Animals in nearby counties found mutilated, their bodies arranged in circular patterns, symbols carved into trees. Locals stopped going anywhere near the area. Those who lived close enough claimed they could sometimes hear faint crying echoing through the night. Not of an animal, not of a person, but something caught in between. In 2010, the FBI reopened the case under a special classification, Project Echo 5. The 5 wasn't random. It referred to the entity Marin had named the Fifth. A secret report, leaked years later, described an operation where drones were sent into the hollow. Most of them failed within minutes, losing signal entirely. But one drone, just before its camera feed went black, captured a single frame. It showed the ruins of the cabin, and in the doorway, 5 shadows standing in a perfect line. The timestamp, 03:15 a.m. The file was labeled, Whittaker Line, active. Today, that hollow no longer appears on public maps. If you search its coordinates, the image blurs, just trees and fog. The locals say the government fenced it off years ago, but every once in a while, hikers stumble across the rusted gate, the warning signs eaten by time. And if you lean close enough to the ground, some say you can hear the faint echo of breathing beneath the soil, like something still waiting. A family that never died, just buried itself deeper, generation after generation, until the earth and their blood became one. When night falls over those mountains, and the wind moves through the trees like a sigh, listen closely, because the Whittakers never left. They're still there, watching, waiting, whispering the same promise they carved into the walls more than a century ago. Our blood keeps us whole. For over a century, the story of the Whittakers existed in fragments, rumors, burned reports, grainy photographs, and voices on old magnetic tape. But by 2024, it was all supposed to be history, forgotten. That's when Dr. Evelyn Hart, a cultural anthropologist from Boston, reopened the file. She wasn't a believer in myths or monsters. She believed in patterns of isolation, trauma, and inherited behavior. She wanted to prove that the Whittaker curse was nothing more than a psychological echo passed down through generations of Appalachian families. But Evelyn made one mistake. She didn't understand that some echoes aren't born in the mind. They come from the ground. She arrived in West Virginia in the late autumn of 2024. The hills were wrapped in fog, the trees skeletal and pale. Locals at the diner refused to speak when she mentioned Whittaker Hollow. "Best let the past rot," one old man said, not looking up from his coffee. But Evelyn smiled politely. "Sometimes rot preserves the truth," she replied. That night she drove toward the restricted zone, now overgrown, the road broken by time. Her GPS froze near the ridge, showing only static lines and a single, flickering coordinate 0.0, 0.0. She left her car behind and continued on foot. The deeper she walked, the quieter it became. No insects, no birds, just a low hum that seemed to rise from the soil itself. By midnight, she reached the hollow. The cabin was gone, or rather, absorbed. The ground had swallowed most of it, leaving behind only the stone chimney and the trapdoor. Evelyn crouched, brushing away dirt. The wood beneath was damp but intact. She hesitated, then lifted it open. The air that escaped was heavy and cold, carrying a faint metallic scent. She lowered herself down, flashlight trembling in her hand. What she found below wasn't just a cellar. It was an entire network, tunnels branching in every direction, carved smooth like veins beneath the earth. The walls glistened faintly, as if breathing. She followed the main tunnel, marking her path with chalk. After several turns, her beam caught something carved into the rock. The familiar phrase, faded but still legible. "Our blood keeps us whole." She took a photo, then continued deeper. Then she heard it, a low whisper, not behind her, not ahead, but all around. The words barely formed, but recognizable. "We stay." Her breath hitched. "Hello?" she called out. The whisper stopped. Then slowly it came again. Closer. "We stay. We stay. We stay." The light in her hand began to flicker. She hit it, once, twice, and for a split second, the tunnel flashed bright, and she saw them. 5 figures standing at the end of the corridor, still, silent, watching. Their faces were pale and sunken. Their eyes clouded over, their bodies thin but rigid, like wax figures half melted by time. The tallest one tilted its head slightly. "Evelyn Hart," it whispered. The voice came from inside her head. Her flashlight shattered against the floor. Darkness swallowed her whole. The next morning, her car was found at the roadside. The engine was running. The door was open. Inside the passenger seat, her recorder, still spinning. The tape lasted only 7 minutes. The first 4 were quiet. Footsteps, breathing, then silence. But at minute 5, a faint heartbeat began to pulse through the static. Then a voice, her own. "There's more than 5 now." The final words were almost a whisper. "They're becoming us." Then, nothing. The recorder stopped. Weeks later, a federal cleanup team arrived to seal the hollow for good. They filled it with concrete, buried it beneath tons of soil, and declared it a hazardous geological site. But the locals knew it wouldn't matter, because that hollow wasn't just under the earth. It was the earth. Every root, every stone, every breath of air in that valley carried a trace of what had once lived there, and what refused to die. 50 miles away, in a laboratory in Charleston, a technician analyzed soil samples taken from the site. He expected traces of methane, mineral buildup, or radiation. What he found instead made him drop his coffee. The DNA markers. They weren't human. At least, not entirely. They were something in between, something that had adapted, something still alive. He sent the data to his supervisor. Hours later, the report disappeared from the system. Every backup, every file, wiped clean. When he returned to his desk that night, there was an envelope waiting for him. Inside, a single photograph, black and white, faded, from the early 1900s, a family of 4, sitting stiffly inside a wooden cabin. And in the background, barely visible through the shadows, a 5th figure, tall and blurred. On the back of the photo, a single handwritten line, "Our blood keeps us whole." And so, the Whittaker legend came full circle. A family that began as a tragedy of isolation had become something far older, something buried in the marrow of the land itself. They didn't vanish. They evolved. And now, they wait, not beneath the soil, but within it, in every breath of wind that crosses those hills, in every rustle of leaves when the forest goes silent. Some say that when the night grows too still, you can hear a voice carried on the wind, soft, gentle, almost human. "We stay, The Whittakers never died. They just changed form. And maybe that's the real horror. Not monsters, not curses, but what happens when humanity closes its doors for too long and becomes something the world no longer recognizes. A reflection, a warning, a whisper in the dark that never ends. If you love the darkness, stay with us. Subscribe before the lights go out.